elaborating about. Well, you know, the reason I didn't tell Jack is I'm afraid if I told him that I was going to come up here and talk about the good motivations and positive considerations, the pure motivations of the treaty party for their actions, that he wouldn't let me come. But I wouldn't do that. Of course, I am indeed. Don't want to come up here in the north and start all of that. And I may be on dangerous ground with what I decided to talk to you all about today. But it's just history. And we may be going through a cultural revolution, so this may be the last we can get to discuss some of it. So I'm going to start. First thing I need to do for this subject, I need to take off the turban and put it aside. And now, it's not good Southern manners to wear your hat in the house, but I'm going to wear this one for a while anyway, because it gives you that, I don't know, that good old cotton plantation vibe that you see. And now don't y'all get nervous. I've got a quote here I want to read. I got to fix this around now so I can fumble with papers just a little bit. I consulted the Encyclopedia of Southern History. It could be used for a doorstop. There's a lot of, not the encyclopedia, it's the Encyclopedia of, yes, of Southern History and Culture. I consulted it for the word Dixie. It said that has become a synonym of the South. The origin not clarified. There's no evidence of its existence on Southern plantations. Nevertheless, Dixieland conjures up those images of that idyllic storybook, fictionalized, romanticized Southern history with big cotton plantations, big staffs, genteel people, lords and ladies of the manor, entertaining at fine barbecues, living in grand style. Now, we all know that that's romanticized, fictionalized. There is some truth to it. You know, it's based in something. So now I'm going to switch and say 55 years ago, when I went to work in town, I began to meet the grandchildren and sometimes even the children of that generation of Cherokees who hoped to establish for themselves an independent Southern Cherokee nation in the south of the Cherokee Nation. They'd hoped to cut off the old Canadian district and came within a hair's breadth of being able to accomplish that after the Civil War and have that set aside for them and for them to have autonomy and self-governance there and to be completely divorced from the Cherokee Nation. I came in contact with these people around Weber's Falls, which was the trade center still at that time. And I probably ought to say to you that I was fifth generation Falls. When my folks brought me home, I was born over in the Creek Nation because they had a hospital over there. And when they brought me home to a two-room tar paper shack where they were living, Grandpa Keithley fished them out of all the buildings floated away in the 43 flood, and to keep the men, the farm hands, from drinking and fighting, they went down and pulled these old buildings up out of the flood water. They took their horses and teams. Anyway, that's beside the point entirely. At that time, I had a grandfather, two grandmothers, three great-grandmothers, a great-grandfather, and a great-great-grandfather, and I met all of them. Y'all, I even knew my grandparents' siblings and some of my great-grandparents' siblings. I was the oldest of the oldest, and I was in the old hometown, and I was on the street from a very young age. So I heard all these stories and discovered pretty quick that not my Cherokee grandmother wasn't the only old Cherokee lady that sat around and babbled about their ancestors and their family connections. And a lot of the people, as I began to get interested in Cherokee history, I was meeting these people in my locale. And often they would say to me, "Oh, your great-grandpa knew a lot about this. He had come down," this is a white grandfather who had come down out of the hills of Arkansas sometime in the 1880s, late 80s or early 90s, to clerk for the Cherokee aristocrats who owned the stores and owned everything down there. And he became enamored of their stories, of their background, of how unique that they were. And so some of them said that I had somehow inherited that. What I discovered was that, yes, Gone with the Wind might be fiction, but there was a community in the Cherokee Nation, in the south of Muskogee County, in the south of the Cherokee Nation, that had all the trappings of those storybook Old South. You got there on a steamboat that most of the year had to stop at Weber's Falls because it had to be high water to get around the falls and get on up to Fort Gibson. And those steamboats landed and found what would be very similar to any old Southern county seat out on the frontier. There's a courthouse on a sort of a square, a log schoolhouse. And out from that, there's not a lot of houses around town. There's only one high ridge where the original merchant on that side of the river, Gunner from Gunnersville, Alabama, a Cherokee guy, his family had steamboats and they brought stuff up there to sell, even in the old settler days. But out from town, you've got big cotton fields, and then you've got, not all the houses were on the order of the mural home or the Van Mansion, Rich Joe Van's mansion in Cartersville. But that one was recreated there. They used the same plan. For years, the descendants said, well, it's just like that one, except the pillars on ours were different. And come to find out, years later, they discovered they had the wrong pillars on the one in Georgia. They knew what they were talking about, these grandchildren who remembered all of that. But few people did. So you had here a people whose life very much mirrored these storybooks. And I began to be very interested in them. And so let me kind of define for you the Cherokee Dixieland proper would be the old Canadian district. Now, this is that part of the Cherokee Nation. If you look on a map, I brought one. And I don't know how folks at home can see it, but y'all can kind of pass these around. They won't be too distracting. You can see in pink where the Canadian district was. And it's not a very big piece of property. You describe it as what's now the southern part of Muskogee County. It starts at the confluence of the Canadian River and the Arkansas and emanates west along those rivers to the creek boundary line. some very, very rich bottomland in those areas that lended itself to big plantation farming. And let's just stop right here and say what, for generations, we just knew that everybody understood. All these grand lifestyles, that was all made possible because of slave labor. There's not any getting around that. You can't put lipstick on that hog and make it look any better. It was a dreadful institution. We're all glad that it's gone. So, having said that, we'll go on and talk about it. The Cherokees that lived that lifestyle did not see themselves as evil. That practice had been, slavery had been practiced all over the world from time immemorial until it was halted. And the halt was led. Who led the halt to slavery? Who started it? The rich, old, white, got to give some, credit every once in a while to, and mostly Christian people in Great Britain. That's who started. That's who started the stopping of it. Then it was France, then it was the United States. Enough about that. I want to talk about the lifestyles of the rich and famous Cherokee and that world at Weber's Falls and at other places in the bottomlands contiguous to the old Canadian district as it went down the river. Now, y'all will stop and say that there were big plantations all over the Cherokee Nation. Some of them didn't grow cotton. Uncle Clem Rogers grew cattle, but he had those black guys who ran everything. They said they had a deal with Uncle Clem after the war. Said, what was the deal? Said they told him what he wanted, and Uncle Clem got it for him because they produced all the food. They kept everything going. However, they produced cotton and a lot of it. Now, so there were those places, but at Weber Falls, you had a place in the Canadian district that it was almost the whole neighborhood was Old South like that. And it was on the river where there was a boat landing and where there were the falls, and it wasn't close to Fort Gibson where you had riffraff from the fort as they saw it, and it wasn't at Park Hill, where there was a bedroom community that was sort of similar to this, where the mural home was and Rose Cottage and all those other kind of places. But the thing that kind of makes this situation unique is that after the Civil War, and a lot of this romanticizing of the Dixieland all occurred after the Civil War. And I think that might be a little bit true for us too, in that there was a good solid attempt to separate and get a separate treaty for the Southern Cherokees, for the people who fought with the South. Now, I want to elaborate a little bit on that and just say that all during that Reconstruction time, they started trying to have treaty negotiations at Fort Smith. And they couldn't get things together. The feds couldn't get treaties made with the tribes. Cherokees, Choctaws. Well, the Cherokees had two factions, Choctaws and Chickasaws didn't. So the treaty negotiations had to be continued in Washington. And so John Ross's government, John Ross is still alive, dang near on his deathbed, but he's still in town. And there's a group of Southerners. William Penn Adair was there part of the time. Old Richard Fields, the nephew of the guy who, by the same name, who was one of the Texas Cherokee chiefs. I think they killed him. John Rollin Ridge, who had never really been in the Cherokee Nation. John Ridge's son, who was a newspaper editor in California, he was on the Southern Cherokee negotiating team. His cousin Saladin Wadey, Stan Wadey's son, was there part of the time. Elias Cornelius Boudinot, the evil Cornelius, they called him, the railroad lawyer in later years, he was there. Part of the time, I think, Joab Scales, son of Nicholas Dalton Scales, Chief Ross's, I think, grandnephew maybe. He was there part of the time, and another missionary son, J.W. Washburn. So they were trying to get this little piece of property set aside for them. And John Ross was trying to keep them from it. Well, they, you know, President Lincoln was gone, and they were dealing with the Andrew Johnson administration. And I don't like to read stuff too much, but I'm going to see if well, I thought I had marked it. Where J.W. Washburn, well, I could have just sworn I had that marked, you all, because I wanted to well, we just can't do that very long. I've lost I'm not going to read it. I'll just tell you what it said. J.W. Washburn was on the boat floating from Washington, and in those days you had to go to Baltimore or somewhere. You could finally get on the Ohio River and go around to the Mississippi and down the Mississippi and through the White and across to Arkansas. He's on the boat. He stopped somewhere. Here it is. Jack found it for me. God bless you, Jack.
That's the right one.
No, that's the wrong. But what he said, it's okay. We don't have to read it, Steve. What he said was, you get busy and you have General Wadey issue a proclamation, and if you can't get but 100 people there, you have a convention and you get a government organized, and you do it right now and don't wait. We'll sort out and elect who. If some people complain, we'll sort it out later. You get it done. We've got to strike while the iron is hot. John Ross has been defeated, but he's still maneuvering around, and you know how evil and scheming he can be. Before they could get it all done, John Ross had schemed and whatever he did, and Johnson's people did not submit that treaty. They drafted another treaty, and they sent that to the Congress, to the Senate, and the Senate ratified it. And there was no separate Southern Cherokee Nation. What they did say was what they did say, Jack's found this, and you all can see if I characterized it correctly if anybody wants to. What they did say was, we will give that district autonomy. We guarantee that you get in the Cherokee government, you will have representation according to your numbers. If you have contract disputes over a certain amount of money, you won't have to take those to the Cherokee Supreme Court. You can appeal directly to the federal court in Fort Smith. You don't have to ask Tahlequah to issue trade permits. You can do that yourself. Other districts, trade permits for traders had to be approved by someone at the capital. Tahlequah didn't have to do that if you're in the Canadian district. So they had several of these provisions to protect them. The Canadian district was set aside as a settling place for Confederate sympathizers and for freed people. In those first few years, several Cherokees that had gone to Texas during the war, moved their families there, they continued to make a crop there because things were so unsettled in the Cherokee Nation. And they were, many people, afraid to go back to their former homes. They were afraid that the Union sympathizing Cherokees would hurt them, would kill them. And so several people then, when these provisions were made, they began migrating. A few of them came back into the Cherokee Nation, into the Canadian district. William Penn Boudinot, I think that's Cornelius's brother, he wrote a letter to somebody from Weber's Falls and said, well, I don't have much law practice here, but it beats throwing myself to the pens across the river. You know, talking about the Union Cherokees, he was afraid could be somewhere else. But before all of those provisions were really called on, before a lot of people moved there, a new political alliance arose. Lewis Downing, considered full-blood, he had some ancestry. He was bilingual. He was a Cherokee Baptist preacher. I think he was very much a part of the Joneses Baptist organization, one of the very strongest institutions in the Cherokee Nation. He was unhappy. He had been a colonel in the Union Cherokee forces, and he was the leader of a group of people who were very unhappy with the leadership of Chief John Ross's maternal nephew, William, I can't think of his second, William Potter Ross, W.P. Ross. W.P. was twice appointed by the council to be chief, but when it came time for the election, the folks elected somebody else. They elected Lewis Downing. From what I can read about that, it sounds like that he was Princeton educated and was just too highfalutin and too refined. He was a good administrator. People respected him. He became mayor of Fort Gibson. I guess that's what led to the Cherokee National Cemetery there. And he's the only chief over there. I think all the rest of them apparently are buried at Tahlequah. That's beside the point. He got beat. Lewis Ross won the election, and here's how he won. He said, there's a certain number of people that follow me, but William Penn Adair, and he was a guy as big as Charlie Soap, but apparently about that charismatic. You know, all these writers talk about, he was the finest Cherokee specimen we ever saw, said Dr. Starr. The Reverend Downing said, the Bible says we have to forget and forgive. And we're going to have to forget and forgive all these tragedies that we've had of infighting. We're going to have to get on with it, or we're not going to have a Cherokee Nation. And if you Southern Cherokees will come and support me, I'll be sure that you're not treated badly. We'll give you a fair share of appointments to the Supreme Court, to boards and commissions. I'll consult with you, and we'll knit this Cherokee Nation back together, and we'll go on. And that's what they did. He was a brilliant politician, if nothing else. And he apparently never wanted to be chief. I think he had his son-in-law made deputy chief, and then the chief died and he became chief. So all of that separate part that the people had hoped for, it really wasn't called for. People started going back where they had been before. Things settled down when they rebuilt the Cherokee Nation. Now, we were under attack, of course, every time the Congress set with some scheme, because the Reconstruction treaties gave, when and if the railroads ever came through, they got every other section of land, and they desperately wanted through. And so they were like big oil now, or some big, they were sowing huge amounts of money into congressional campaigns and what have you. So y'all, that kind of covers the political part of this. But you know, for there to be a real Dixieland we'd have to look at it. What I saw and found very interesting was sort of these Cherokee aristocrats' outlook. And I began, even as a kid, you could tell that these old Cherokee ladies from these very distinguished old families had a Cherokee brogue. They spoke with very cultivated, very genteel, very mannerly. And they didn't wear the hat in the house, anything like that. So I was trying to articulate, trying to ask questions about it. So one Cherokee, we called her Aunt Bell. I think she was some distant cousin. Said, Aunt Bill, I know there were differences in some people were. How did you know when people started moving in? Because they associated with newcomers after, even after statehood, these grandchildren did. I said, how did you determine who were on your? She said, oh, honey, I think I know what you're talking about. Said, you could tell by people's deportment and their manners and their manner of speaking and dress and so forth. You could get a very good idea. I said, but when you were children, how was that communicated? How did she said, well, I'll tell you how my mother put it to us. Said, those folks moved in down there. And she said, now, girls, you see that the Joneses have come to farm Aunt Judy's property over here. Said, I met Mrs. Jones. Said, those are very good, salt of the earth, hardworking people. I said, I think they're honest and honorable, and we may be seeing them at functions, but they're not our kind. I want to kind of share with you a little bit, dropping back to the time before the war. We all know that Scarlett O'Hara was fictional, but there was a girl about her age who lived at Weber's Falls. Her name was Ella Cootie. Her father was Chief Ross's heir apparent, William Shorey Cootie, who wrote the Cherokee Constitution and articles of Act of Union. Thank you, Jack. The Act of Union. And he died in Washington. He was a guy that hung out with the newspaper writers, commented on he and Daniel Webster strolling down the streets of Washington. When he built his house, he built it in the neighborhood of where the Three Rivers Health Center is on the edge of Muskogee, closer down on the river. It's called Frozen Rock. She was born there in 1849. He died in Washington. And in a few years, she said that my mother wasn't long before she was young and pretty and well-educated, that she had plenty of chances to marry, and she married Rich Joe Vann's son, John. And they lived, I'm not sure if they lived at Frozen Rock or at Brewers, they lived somewhere else while he built her a nice 14-room home on the second bench at Weber Falls in the neighborhood where his sister Sally Van Boer lived with her husband Israel G. Boer, who was a merchant. And she told about, said, well, mother had all the help she needed. So there was a nurse and a nurse's aide and a cook and a cook in training and a laundress and a footman, butler, and there was a coachman and a gardener, and out those people all considered themselves a cut above the people who worked out in the shops, the blacksmiths, the wheelwrights, the and 2 steps above the field hands who lived in the quarters. And she talked about those people, and she said, well, the cook was much too busy to have time for me, but mother took me in the kitchen on Sunday when the cook was off, that was her day off, so that I could learn, basic cooking skills. And she said, and I remember the first time I prepared a meal and all the men praised it very highly. She also talked about the cousins that would come and stay 3 or 4 months, 6 months at a time. And you were supposed to do that. And they had plenty of staff. It wasn't a hardship on the family. At court time, Weber's Falls was the seat of government for Canadian District. And in October and in April, they had court. Well, there weren't any hotels in those days. Everybody would just stay with friends or relatives. And so her grandfather, Richard Fields, was a lawyer. He would be staying there. There were people over at the Vans, no doubt. People all around would come into town, and that, however long it took for the court to try all the cases they had to try that from, the whole town was full. I remember one story of the Reverend Stephen Foreman's daughter was boarding at Mrs. Van's teaching school down there during the Civil War. And there was a break and the men were home, and in her diary she put, oh, I wish Bob Hanks would come and play his fiddle. And another time she wrote, and we danced all night, and what would Paul say? Because her father was the Baptist preacher. I think he was a Baptist, Stephen Foreman. Now, I don't know how long I've been at you all, so I don't know whether to tell you another good story illustrating these, and this one comes from the time closer to statehood, illustrating kind of the old Southern Cherokee aristocrats thinking. I do want to share with you that this community was distinct, and it lasted until, well, I could even notice it without any teaching that there was something there. And so as I began to piece history together, but even up until the Sequoyah Convention, there was an effort. And I'll hand these around. You see this place in pink here? It says Breckenridge, and it encompasses pretty much what was the old Canadian District. If you matched it to the county above it that says Muskogee, it would look like Muskogee County looks today. There was intended for the state of Sequoyah a county called Breckenridge in the south of Muskogee County, covering this same area that we've been talking about, the old Canadian District. And by all the records you see of the Sequoyah Convention burnt. So I think what we know comes from newspaper articles mostly. So I began to say, who was this Breckenridge that they wanted to name this area after? And I'm pretty sure it's General Breckenridge, who was vice president, senator from Kentucky, secretary of war for the Confederacy. I think it was him. I can't find the proof altogether, but it stands to reason that this is who they wanted to call their county after them. And, you know, we got done out of the state of Sequoyah, so that didn't happen. I would tell you that in the first legislative session in Oklahoma, first Oklahoma session, there was a bill introduced that would have bifurcated Muskogee County so that it would have court not only in Muskogee, but also at Weber's Falls. the Cherokee Nation had built the Canadian District Courthouse there, it would have been a natural place for that. That bill failed. And as I was growing up, I remember writing up something about and one of Rich Joe Van's descendants, richest man in the Cherokee Nation, lived there. Of course, the descendants are all still there, same families farming the bottom that have been since Civil War before. And she, at the end of she said, here's you a sentence, you can have this. It said, in Weber's Falls for 150 years, it's withstood fires, floods, Yankees, and the Corps of Engineers, and it's still here. And that's what I would say. I'm not sure the Corps of Engineers weren't the worst end of it all, but they didn't put a torch to it. Now, having done this for so long, if any of you guys, I'll set these up and you can have a look at them. These are pictures of people, and there's too much information on these boards, but they do give some illustration of some of the people and some of what went on. I didn't tell the story. Here's Miss Ella Cootie Robinson that I was talking about, and that's her aunt. I guess it's step aunt's house nearby. The Yankees burned this house at Weber, but the one in Georgia made it. It's still standing. And an interior view, and you can see kind of some of their lifestyles by looking around at the mural. Because Rich Joe Van's son, he married Lewis Ross's daughter. Another daughter of Lewis Ross married Earl. They owned Hunter's home, but they were gone during the war. So Rich Joe Van's son, James Frankston, he and his wife lived in Hunter's home. Shirley's book spells a bunch of that. Anyway, I've had these for years, and I just thought of what y'all might want to see. So I think I talked long enough today. I hope I gave you a flavor of the South of the Cherokee Nation.
But tell a story. When you said, just a couple minutes ago, you said, "Oh, whether I should tell you the story or not."
Okay. Now, this has to do. There's two little towns. You see, Weber's Falls, where all the proper folks live, but when the railroad came, there were people, not ever, all this community didn't live over in the Canadian District. When you got on the north side of the Arkansas, Dr. Campbell had a ferry across there. And he had a house over on that side of the river. You go across Ray Fine Bridge between Weber Falls and that other town. And his family still lives there, his descendants, but he had a house there in that neighborhood. And he ran the ferry, and whenever the water got up high, everybody wound up staying with Dr. Hanks and his wife, whichever one. Because people at Weber Falls always had a little, he married his cousin, and then she passed away, and he married her sister, and then he divorced her and married some other gal, and I don't know what all, but they always babbled a lot about that. But what they said was, whichever wife he had at the time when the railroad came through, you could preserve a little more of your land if you laid out of town. And the wife kept fussing at him to lay out of town and build a hotel because she was tired of a house full of unpaid guests. So the people at Weber Falls, in that one newspaper article I need to find, they referred to it. They said, well, that was really just the Campbell station was just the railroad stopped to service Weber's Falls, and you had to take a hack and go out to the ferry and cross the river to the real town. It was really kind of that way when I grew up there. And so the people, I said that other town because they didn't really ever say the G word. they'd say over there across the river, yonder on the tracks, in that other town over there in that other county. And so I started trying to get to the root of that, and I asked Aunt Beth, because she was 89, and she'd say whatever, you know. I said, Aunt Beth, what about that? I said, I know the kind of the history heritage of Weber Falls. We had plantations and cotton and steamboats, and so the fine horses. Yeah, I said, what about? I said, well, over there across the river, that other. Oh, honey, I said, I see what you're getting at. That other town there. I said, you know, honey, I said, due to my advance, yes, I can be brutally frank if I so choose. I suppose I do. I said, I characterize that situation for you very succinctly. So, honey, that's just a lot of railroad trash blowed up on the tracks over there, and they've yet to clean that mess up. That was her characterization of the town of, well, it was Campbell. And the other thing the Cherokee lady said, the very idea, forsake the heritage and the man that founded the town for them, for the sake of for baseball uniforms. A populist senator from Mississippi. What was his name? He was Gore Vidal's grandpa. Thomas P. Gore. He and Robert L. Owen got elected first United States senators from Oklahoma. And his aides came along and said that if they would name the town in place of Campbell, if they would name it after him, they would he'd buy their baseball team new uniforms. And so that's what they did. And I don't know, this is probably, I'll just tell y'all this, this is what I heard. Senator Gore was a blind fellow, like my Uncle Garland, who was brilliant. I don't know about Senator Gore, but one old Cherokee lady, very politically incorrect and insensitive, said, yes, they've named it after a blind senator, and it's the blind been leading the blind over there across the river ever since. I've probably said enough to damage me for a generation. So it's probably time for me to stop. Is there any, can I tell y'all anything else? There's more where that came from. Y'all hadn't heard about when the Yankees swooped down to disrupt the Cherokee legislative session, but that'd take too long. I had to come back. Jack, you have to let me go and tell that story a different time. Thanks, guys. It's good to see everybody out there. All right, Peter. Well,